The neighbours and the news. Sometimes grown-ups can be so confusing they make you scratch your head. When Officer Martina took me home, Mum was the angriest I had ever seen her. At first it was scary because she kept shouting things like, "I can't believe you did this," and "What if something had happened to you?" But then she would hug me and hold me so tight I thought my bones were going to be crushed. I wasn't quite sure if I was being told off or not. When she had calmed down, Mum made me hot soup and told me to tell her everything. So I told her about Ahmet's pictures and about what the man and woman on the bus had said about the gates and the greatest idea in the world and the emergency plan and everything that had happened in front of the Queen's palace. Mum was quiet while I talked, and then, after I had finished telling her everything, she sat still for a long time and didn't say anything at all. I was too scared to say anything else, so I sat on my hands and stared at the table. Finally, Mum opened her mouth to say something, but then the doorbell rang. "Who's that, I wonder?" Mum said. When she opened the door, Mrs. Gillingham, the neighbour who lived next door to Mrs. Abbey, was standing outside. She always wears lots of necklaces and bright pink nail varnish and long dangly earrings. I like her because she smells like puff pastry, and at Christmas she always gives me a stocking filled with sweets. "Oh, hiya, love," cried out Mrs. Gillingham. "Thank goodness you're back safe and sound. But my, that was brave of you, wasn't it? The woman on the news said it was so you could help the refugees." "Sorry, Mrs. Gillingham," said Mum, frowning. "Did you just say on the news?" "Oh, it's all over the telly, all over it," said Mrs. Gillingham. "I expect you'll hear from the reporters soon." "Oh, thank you for letting us know, Mrs. Gillingham." Mum started to close the door. "We'd better get some rest. It's been a long day." She waved Mrs. Gillingham out of the door and looked down at me. The news. Just then, the doorbell rang again. "Who is it?" called out Mum. "It's Mr. Rashid," came a man's voice, and then a loud "Ouch!" before he added, "And Mrs. Rashid." Mum looked at me in surprise and opened the door again. This time, exactly where Mrs. Gillingham had been standing were Mr. and Mrs. Rashid. They lived one floor below us and have twins. You can tell when they're home because they always leave the pushchair in the landing as it's too big to fit through the door. We usually only ever see them in the lift or when they need help getting the pushchair out of the main doors, but I like them. Especially Mrs. Rashid because she wears the brightest clothes. Once she wore a long flowing dress that had millions of tiny sequins on it and made her shine like a goldfish. She's always smiling and laughing with the babies, and Mr. Rashid likes to shout out the cricket scores to anyone he can find. But this was the first time they had ever come to our flat. "Hello," said Mum. Mrs. Rashid held up her phone. "We've just read all about it," she cried, shoving it into Mum's hand and pointing to a news story with a picture of lots of palace guards standing around someone on the floor. "You were so brave. Now the Queen herself can't ignore what's happening to those families. I haven't slept for months thinking about it. Months. It makes me so angry. All those poor people with their little babies trying to just live. We send baby clothes and shoes whenever we can, but we don't have much money to spare," continued Mr. Rashid. "And now," Mrs. Rashid spotted me over Mum's shoulder and bent down. "Oh, you darling, please let me hug you." I hesitated for a moment. I don't always like being hugged. But Mrs. Rashid seemed nice, so I slowly walked over to her and let her hug me, and then I hugged her back. "If your refugee friend needs any help, any at all, please tell us," she said. "Yes?" "Promise," said Mr. Rashid. I nodded, because I knew Ahmet would probably like Mr. and Mrs. Rashid and wouldn't mind me asking them for help. "Good, now you take care," grinned Mr. Rashid, as he and his wife turned away and headed down the stairs. "Well, this is turning out to be quite a day, isn't it?" laughed my mum, looking down at me and giving my shoulders a squeeze. But before she could close the door, Mr. Greggs's huge head suddenly popped in. I took a step back and hid behind Mum because I don't like Mr. Greggs at all, even though he always dresses in a suit and takes his hat off whenever he sees anyone he likes. I can tell Mum doesn't like him either because she never says hello to him when we see him, and my mum always says hello to everyone, even the man who sleeps in the doorway of Mr. Pileski's shop on the corner of our road. "Yes, Mr. Greggs, what can I do for you?" asked Mum in her most polite voice. She only ever uses that voice when she talks to people she doesn't like Auntie Christina or the man with the clipboard who calls himself the landlord. Mr. Greggs cleared his throat and said, "I've just dropped by to say that your daughter there would do well to mind her own business. Those pesky refugees are only here because they want a piece of our benefits pie. She ought to know better, and you ought to have taught her better." I looked up at Mum's face and saw it had gone as white as one of our dinner plates as she stared at Mr. Greggs without blinking. "Have you finished?" she said, in a voice that was so cold I didn't recognise it. "All I'm saying is that your child was nearly killed today for immigrant pests that want the easy life without having to work a day for it. I mean, I know you're not exactly white, but you've been here long enough to know better, surely." "Mr. Greggs, that is quite enough," said Mum, her voice cold and formal. Her eyes had narrowed and her hands had become tight little balls. "You and your views are not welcome here. Please leave." And taking a step back, Mum slammed the door shut just as loudly as she could, so that one second Mr. Greggs was there and the next he wasn't. We could hear him ranting at us from the other side, but after a few seconds his voice started to get fainter and fainter. "Despicable man," muttered Mum, clicking the extra bolt on the door shut, "with his dinner jackets and silly neckerchiefs trying to cover up his bigotry." "Why is he so angry, Mum?" I asked. "And why did he call refugees pests?" "Because he's a heartless, selfish man who hates everyone far too much to want to help anyone," said Mum, "even refugee children like Ahmet." "Oh," I said, wondering how anyone could hate someone who was running away from bullies and bombs. Mr. Greggs had clearly never met someone like Ahmet before, because if he had, he could never have been so horrible about anyone who had to become a refugee. "Now, let's forget about Mr. Greggs and go and see what the news is saying about you, shall we?" She ruffled my hair and then went and switched on the telly as I did a running jump onto the sofa. After a few seconds, a newsreader flashed up onto the screen. Her voice was warm as she said, "Today, an incident at Buckingham Palace added an extra few steps to the changing of the guard ceremony, as a 9-year-old child ran out and intercepted one of the Queen's Coldstream guards." As she talked, the picture changed, and I appeared on the screen, running out of the crowd and reaching up to touch a palace guard's arm with Tom just a few steps behind me. I looked so scared it made me wonder how I had done what I did. I had never, ever seen anyone I knew on the television before, and it was the strangest thing in the world not only see myself on it, but to have done something that the newsreader was talking about. It transpired that the child in question wanted to hand in a note for the Queen, appealing for help on behalf of a refugee boy searching for his parents following their joint escape from the ongoing conflict in Syria. We are expecting an official response from Buckingham Palace later this evening. Mum quickly flicked over to the next channel. Another newsreader was talking, and behind him was another picture of me, looking shocked and scared. "The Queen's Guard had an unexpected encounter today as a young child broke through the barriers during the famed changing of the Guard's ceremony. It is said the attack was made in protest against the government's poor handling of the refugee crisis." "But I didn't attack anyone," I cried out. Mum nodded but didn't say anything, and instead switched the channel to another newsreader. The third newsreader confused me the most because he said, "A 9-year-old child sparked a terrorist alert today after disturbing the changing of the Guard's ceremony and raising wider questions about security." Mum leaned over and turned off the sound. "But I didn't want to hurt anyone," I said, trying not to cry. "Why do they think I'm a terrorist?" You'll have to find out in the next part.